Hello, I'm Majid Beni and you have to be able to see my screen right now. I'm Majid Beni, I'm from Middle East Technical University, and I'm both proud and humbled for being accepted into this conference. And also, it is very fortunate that my talk is right after Carl Friston's talk, because I can take over from precisely where he left. And at any rate, I wouldn't be able to speak to describe free energy principle with that clarity and grace. I'm very happy about that. The basic insight of this talk is this: there are two main interpretations of free energy principle: account of consciousness along the lines of Qualia realism and illusionism. And I'm going to argue that none of these interpretations is satisfactory, because they are both engaging perhaps too deeply with the hard problem. And please note that I say that both Qualia realism and the free energy principle are engaging too deeply with the hard problem. So if you come from philosophy, you may expect only from the Qualia realism to be redealt by the hard problem. But I'm going to argue that they are both engaged with the hard problem, perhaps too deeply. And I criticize this view, and if there is time, I don't know whether there will be enough time, but I'm going to also introduce a third interpretation in terms of a strong intentionalism. This is the structure of this talk. I was supposed to speak about free energy principle, and I'm going to skip that part because Carl Friston has already spoke about that with such grace and clarity. I'm going to speak briefly about free energy principle, account of consciousness. I'm going to speak about the Qualia realist interpretation of the free energy principle and criticize it. And then I'm going to speak about the illusionist, or rather the semi-illusionist interpretation of free energy principle, account of consciousness, and criticize it. If we have time, I'm going to also speak about the strong intentionalist interpretation, but I'm not sure about whether I would have enough time for that or not. So, as I say, it is about free energy principle organisms that tend to maximize their survival most place an upper bound on their sensory entropy, and surprisal is defined in terms of the negative log probability of an outcome. So an improbable outcome is very surprising, and a generative model is a probabilistic model of the dependencies between causes and consequences. And there's an account of perception, but we already learned about all of that from Friston's talk. So I cut to the chase and speak about the free energy principle-based account of consciousness, which has been stated in a number of different places. I'm going to focus on Solms and Friston's 2080 paper with occasional references to a couple of other works from Solms and Friston. But this is basically the paper that provides a good Qualia realist understanding of the free energy principle account of consciousness. So this is the general insight behind the account of consciousness. Organism can model their expectation about the world. In addition to the structure of the world itself, the organism can also model their expectation about the world, and they can form estimation of the precision of their prediction about the world. This speaks to the temporal depth or thickness of models, and active inferences in such organisms is based on the distribution of posterior beliefs over actions under the prior belief that the action will minimize free energy in future. And as Friston has already mentioned, this leads to an account of consciousness, self-consciousness, agency, and so on. So according to this approach, a self-conscious system is a system that can simulate multiple futures under different actions and select the action that has the least surprising outcome. More specifically, in the context of the work of Solms and the works of Solms and Friston, this centrancephalic structures embed the content of consciousness, and this is precisely the key point, the pivotal point when the Qualia realist reading begins, because the free energy principle can model not only the level of consciousness, as some other scientific theories of consciousness could, but the claim here is that it also can model the content of consciousness, which has been stated in terms of qualia and the raw field. And if you remember from the last slides of Friston's talk, there is an account of qualia in terms of raw field. I think that Friston related that to Thomas Metzinger's account of consciousness, but as I say, I'm speaking about a Solms and Friston paper. So let me clarify my sense of qualia realism. So qualia realism is ontological realism about the subjective features of experience, right? And the tricky point here is that in light, or rather in the shadow of the hard problem, these subjective experiences are supposed to be ineffable or physically inexplicable. So it would be perfect if we could have an account of subjective experiences under free energy principle that doesn't depend on an ineffable and physically inexplicable account of consciousness. And this is, I try to do in the third part of this talk, but to the extent that present extant theories of qualia realism are at issue, they assume that there is an extra element, extra physical element that constitutes consciousness or subjective element. And interestingly enough, in a brave move, Solms and Friston try to account for the raw field or qualia or the content of consciousness in terms of minimization of free energy principle, in terms of the function of consciousness, which is supposed to amount to registering internal rather than external state. And in this context, conscious qualia arise not from external perception, but from internal arousal processes that activate them. So it all boils down, as I will mention very quickly, in terms of felt certainty. So consciousness is the result of minimization of free energy in the brain, or more precisely, mechanism that could be stated in terms of selective arousal, the brain arousal mechanisms that are triggered in order to flesh out salience, in order to realize features of salience and generate specific feelings about specific things. So affective conception of precision optimization functions is conjured in order to account for motivation, desire, and action. And it is supposed that affective functionalism, unlike cognitive functionalism, is not a target of the hard problem. The hard problem is that we can't explain consciousness only on the basis of cognitive and behavioral functions. And Solms and Friston argue that subjective character of experience, or what it is likeness, can be explained in terms of mechanism of selective arousal, because these mechanisms are not they do not lead to features of experience that are extrinsic to brain's mechanisms or brain's functions. So what it is likeness is not extrinsic to affective function in the same sense that it is extrinsic to cognitive perceptual functions. And I think that it is a very smart move. It is precisely why I direct my criticism. So my criticism is that even if we could demonstrate that consciousness consists in felt uncertainty or minimization of felt uncertainty or the relevant optimization and estimation mechanisms, we still need to bridge the explanatory gap between the physical mechanisms that realize felt uncertainty and the phenomenal character or the subjective character of felt uncertainty. More clearly, we have to ask on which side of the physical mental divide would the account of minimization of felt uncertainty would fall. So if it is stated in terms of physical correlates of consciousness, then we have to face the hard problem and the explanatory gap once more. But if we consider that as a primarily subjective character, then it seems that free energy principle has not been successful in developing an account of consciousness on the basis of mechanisms of brain which are supposed to have some sort of biological reality. So it was the Qualia realist part of the talk. I have to also quickly speak about the illusionist, or rather the semi-illusionist reading of free energy principle account of consciousness, which has been stated in the brilliant paper of Clark, Friston, and Wilkinson, based in Qualia. So illusionism has been a brilliant idea by Daniel Dennett and Keith Frankish. Experiences do not need to be phenomenal properties. They could be quasi-phenomenal properties, or rather physical properties of experience that are misrepresented as phenomenal. And the appeal of this account of consciousness, this illusionist account for the free energy principle, is completely obvious. So, because the hard problem is not supposed to occur, because the ineffable intrinsic character of experience is not important for the illusionist. And the illusionist account allegedly allows for explicating confidence, which is the centerpiece of free energy principle-based account of consciousness in terms of physical tokens. So I just skip this primary concern because we do not have enough time. The main point is that let's assume that predictive processing consists of assigning precision to low and high level beliefs. So this means that I could be confident about the fact that it is a snowing node without being certain about the nature of the snow, whether it is real or synthetic or made of the fabric of dreams or whatever, right? So on the basis of the same logic, an illusionist reading may want to say that theory of consciousness is based on the brain's estimation of its certainty or felt uncertainty or mechanisms of optimization or estimation. And this account is consistent with multiple ways that the real world might be, or even with scenarios in which there is no reality at all. And this was supposed to be the illusionist part, because this account of consciousness is supposed to be compatible with skepticism about the real world. But the main point is that in order to be a good illusionist, you shouldn't deny the reality of the external world. So people knew that it is possible to develop an account of free energy principle that is compatible with radical forms of skepticism. So, for example, Jacob Howe is discussing this issue in How to Entertain Your Markov Blankets, I think. How to entertain your demon. And so it has been around for quite a while, but it is not the illusionist wants to say. The illusionist wants to say that phenomenal experiences are not real. It is not about the reality of the external world. So what
you have 2 minutes left.
All right,
you have 2 minutes left.
All right, that's fine. I would finish in 2 minutes. So what the paper actually achieved is actually achieving, Clark and colleagues' paper, is that it shows that the free energy principle-based account of consciousness is compatible with skepticism about the external world. So there is something tricky about the paper. And the tricky part is that it is developing a semi-illusionist theory. But I think that what it actually does is that it tries to provide a Qualia realist reading of consciousness, which is liable to the objection that I mentioned before, but a form of Qualia realism that is compatible with a version of skepticism about the real world. And I do not think that this version is viable enough. So in less than a minute, I'm just going to allude to a solution that I wanted to develop. I wanted to say that it is possible to develop a strong intentionalist account of free energy principle theory of consciousness in the basis of creating intentionality as the mark of the mental. So the account is much older, goes back to Brentano and to Aristotle before that. And there are points of affinity in terms of the relation between the notion of intentionality itself and the notion of attention. Intentional act could be related to active inferences, and both accounts are compatible with the form of structuralism. And it is my last slide, so I'm going to finish right now. But what makes this account interesting is that unlike these two other accounts, we do not need to engage with the question of physicalism or the reality of qualia at all. So the realism would be exercised about the structure of intentionality, like about the structure of active inferences, regardless of whether there are such things as qualia or not. So the main claim of realism here is about the psychological capacities that give rise to consciousness. And I think that this is precisely what Solms and Friston, so here I'm putting word in their mouth, but I think that it is what Friston and Solms and Clark and Friston and colleagues wanted to really say when they were trying to develop Qualia realist and semi-illusionist readings of free energy principle account of consciousness. So I think that I have to finish right now. I could continue if there are any questions or